Okay, first of all, I would like to really thank Rainer for his very gracious introduction. This afternoon, he came to the hotel where I'm staying, full of gifts, including his latest manuscript, which I will dutifully read, and I'm sure that I will learn a lot from his latest work. I would also like to thank the two deans who are here, the Dean of the Faculty and the Dean of Philosophy. I was telling the Dean of the Faculty that every time I see him at a talk of this nature, I feel deeply reassured. I would like to thank the university and the center for the hospitality, which means a lot to some of us in a world in which solidarity and hospitality seems to be increasingly criminalized. I have a thought for Andrea, who has been very nice to me, and I understand that she can't attend tonight's lecture because of a small accident, as well as Elizabeth. And I'm really happy to be in this magnificent room. I've never been in a room like this, and I hope it won't be too intimidating. So during the first lecture, which took place at the university, I intimated that the government of human mobility might well be one of the most important problems to confront the world during the first half of the 21st century. And since then, my take on this hasn't changed. I think tonight I still believe that this is the case. I think that the capacity to decide who can move and who can settle where and under what conditions might become the core of ongoing political struggles over sovereignty and nationalism, citizenship and identity, or, for that matter, security and freedom. I strongly suggested the other day that with Western colonial expansion, and more decisively with the advent of capitalism, the raison d'etre of the border is to attend to key questions such as to whom does the earth belong, who can lay what types of claims to what parts of it, and for that matter to the various beings who inhabit them. In other words, who determines its distribution or its partition. I really believe that that is what borders are all about. That's what they have been all about, and that is what they will be all about as we enter this new century. In framing the question of the border in this way, I was trying to show that the power of the border lies in its capacity to regulate the multiple distributions of populations, and by populations I don't simply mean human populations, I mean also non-humans, to regulate their distributions over the body of the earth, and in so doing to affect the vital forces of all kinds of beings, enhancing some of these vital forces for some and crippling them for others. And in the process, sorting out who is whom, who should live where, who can move under what conditions, and so forth and so on. I also argued that as the 21st century unfolds, a global renewed desire from both citizens and their respective states for a tighter control of mobility is evident. And wherever we look, in fact, the drive is towards enclosure, or in any case, towards an intensification of the dialectics of opening and closure. So, if you want, two things are going on simultaneously. The world is becoming more and more entangled. So, on the one hand, planetary entanglement, and on the other, a desire, if you want, for secession, a desire for separation, a desire for enclosure. And what we have to be able to think is that simultaneous process. I then went to some extent showing that the belief, one of the dominant myths of our times, is the belief that the world would be safer if only risks, ambiguity, and uncertainty could be controlled. And this is shared worldwide. The belief that we would be safer, our lives would be enhanced, if only identities could be fixed once for all and secured. And these beliefs are gaining momentum. Where the discourse of identity used to be deployed at the service of emancipation, of further inclusion, expanded belonging, that discourse of identity has been co-opted increasingly and put at the service of closure. So, we live in a world where risk management techniques have become one of the dominant means to govern mobilities. And these technologies are, in fact, proliferating. So that was a short summary for those of you who couldn't attend the first lecture. I evoked many more issues, but this short summary will help you to then move into what I would like to share with you tonight. So tonight I would like to pursue this line of argument concerning the redistribution of the earth, not only through the control of bodies, but also the control of movement itself and its corollary, speed, because it's almost impossible to speak about movement without evoking in the same process speed. Speed and movement go hand in hand. And this has been always the case. This is even more the case today with what some, here speaking under the control of Reiner, many sociologists now call acceleration. More specifically, I would like to see whether and under what conditions we could re-engineer the utopia of a borderless world, taking into consideration the contemporary matrix of flows, closures, and circulations, including the circulation of various forms of capital. Now you'll ask me, but why is it important to excavate once again this old utopia, which I don't believe we will ever see in our own lifetime? Why is it important to attend once again to what is obviously an impossible intent, the question of a borderless world? I think this is important for a number of reasons. The first reason, which is conceptual, is that from its inception, movement, or in fact borderlessness, has been central to the utopian tradition. Utopia is about the absence of borders, strictly speaking. And in the first instance, the borders of imagination. The utopic is about the implosion, the unfixing of all borders that might put limits to the act of imagination, understood in itself as a social process, as a political process, or as an aesthetic form. So in the concept of utopia is already embedded this idea of the absence of borders, of borderlessness. In fact, the power of utopianism resides in its ability to instantiate the tension between borderlessness, movement, and place, which has marked, when we look at it properly, social transformations throughout the modern era, as many historians have shown, that social movements are, in fact, when they are at their most powerful, they are about the absence of borders. I think this tension continues in contemporary discussions of movement-based social processes, particularly international migration, open borders, transnationalism, or discussions on cosmopolitanism, which, as we know, have a very German inflection from Kant to Ulrich Beck and a number of others. And in this context, I believe that the idea of a borderless world can be a powerful, albeit problematic, resource for social, political, and aesthetic imagination. And that's one of the reasons why we have to recover it, recapture it, and redeploy it at the service of an idea of the world that is premised on the, let's say, the project of relationality, relations, as opposed to the project of essence, relation before ontology. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that precisely because of the current atrophy of the utopian imagination, apocalyptic imaginaries and narratives of cataclysmic disasters and unknown futures have colonized the spirit of our times. If you want, what I'm saying is that we have too much dystopia and too few utopias. Science fiction, cinema, techno music, all kinds of narratives are saturated by a dystopian impulse. For those of you who are interested in reading the cultural creations of our times, they are, to a large extent, determined and shaped by a dystopian imagination. So obviously, it's not as if we are living in a time of excess when it comes to utopian imagination. And therefore, critical thought, part of critical thought's function is, in such a context, to, if only, re-equilibrate things and inject a little bit of utopia in the spirit of these times of ours. And more importantly, because we inherit a planetary history in which the consistent sacrifice of some lives for the betterment of others is the norm, and because these are deep-seated times of anxiety, including anxieties of racialized others taking over the planet, racial violence is increasingly encoded in the language of the border and the language of security. And I'm sure you understand why, coming from where I come from, I believe that these are issues that we should put on the table. Because contemporary borders are in danger of becoming sites of reinforcement, reproduction, and intensification of vulnerability for stigmatized and dishonored groups, for the most racially marked, ever more disposable, those that in this era of abandonment have been paying the heaviest of prices, for instance, for the most expensive period of prison construction in human history, the last 2 decades of the 20th century. And imprisonment, incarceration, is precisely the exact opposite of borderlessness, just as, at least in the American case, slavery was the exact antithesis of freedom. That liberal political order has constantly operated with these two faces, this double body, a solar body if you want, and a nocturnal one, under which, in the shadow of which, those who have been stigmatized and dishonored are sacrificed for the betterment of some lives. So that's why I put it on the table. Now, in proposing to re-examine the question of a borderless world, I would like to stay away from dominant ways in which this issue has usually been dealt with. That is, either under the sign of Kant. I'm not saying that we have to reject Kant entirely, but we really have to correct Kant. Or if you are not happy with such a term, we have to supplement Kant. We have to add to Kant that which is missing if we want to speak from a global perspective. Because, okay, and I will stop the polemic there, because the Kant of critical reason, the Kant of the human who actualizes his or her potential, is the same Kant who, if you look at his anthropology of taste, is a very racist thinker. You wouldn't believe what Kant says about others. It contradicts completely the Kant of the Enlightenment. So there are two Kants, if you want. The Kant of Enlightenment and the Kant of the ténèbres, of darkness, where matters of race become totally contradictory with the impulse for freedom. So that's why it seems to me that in rethinking matters of borderlessness today, we have to supplement him if you want. And his promise of an unbounded cosmopolitanism, cum post-national politics and society. So that's one, let's say, path one needs to tread extremely carefully. There is a second path one needs to tread carefully as well. It's about treating borderlessness under the sign of liberal individualism, which many consider to be an antidote to the deeply ingrained fascist impulses of European bureaucracies. When you read Hannah Arendt, for instance, chapter 2 of Race and Bureaucracy, that is what she's basically arguing. That to some extent, if we are to defeat fascism, which she considers to be deeply ingrained in, if you want, quote unquote, the genes of Western bureaucracy, Western political order, including liberal political order, we have to, let's say, recover the emancipatory resources that are put to us by the ideology of liberal individualism. So these are two, let's say, traditions I think have helped us to think carefully about what a borderless world might be, but whose limits are just too obvious for these times of ours. I think that we should also move away from a third tradition, which is trying to argue for a borderless world on the basis of a huge attachment to the market principle. There is an economic tradition that believes that, in fact, in order to, that there are three types of, now there's a little problem here. Let me just readjust the microphone. I'm not sure that I can do it. Are you still here following me? Okay, so it's close. I'll leave it at that because. So you do have a tradition, that liberal tradition, let's call it like that, which is premised on fetishism of the market. A market society is what? A market society is a society which has somewhat in which four kinds of freedoms have been obtained. Freedom of movement of capital, freedom of movement for goods, freedom of movement for services, and freedom of movement for human beings. Those are the four freedoms, without which there is no market society, as in fact the Eucharistic sacramental manifestation of this big ideal we call freedom. It is manifested in the capacity to move of these four key, let's say, agents. So, in that tradition, migration is key. And when you read The Economist, the economic magazine, The Economist is for the dismantling of borders, including for human beings. And in that sense, they are consequential. They take to its ultimate limits the fetishism of the market. So when I say a borderless world, I'm not talking in the language of The Economist, if you want. That's the point I want to make. I'm not espousing this. So what is it that I mean then? Of course, a borderless world would be a world of free movement of persons. It would entail it. And this free movement of people would not be restricted to the core economically rich countries or states of the world. It's a world in which these rights would be extended, including to poor members of the earth. And I'll come back to that distinction a little later. And if you really want me to be extravagant, it's a world in which there would be no visas. There wouldn't be any quotas or bizarre entry categories to fulfill. One could just get on a plane, on a train, on a boat, on the road. The key right would be a right of non-discrimination. So I was extravagant, now I'm serious. It would be a right to not be discriminated. It would be an entirely different kind of right. It doesn't exist so far, if it does, it only exists indirectly. If it exists as we speak, including in liberal societies, it's in terms of a negative right. So let's turn it into a positive right. The right to not be discriminated. That's what I mean philosophically by a borderless world. Let's move beyond questions of visas. These are consequences of a philosophical position. So, a right of non-discrimination implying that it would be a world in which circulatory and pendular migrations would be the norm. The norm would be for people to move, for bodies to move. For a body to exist, it has to be a body that is capable of exercising the faculty of motion. There's no body that is not moving, that is not capable of moving, or that which is assigned to immobilization. It's not a human body. So, pendular, cyclical, circulatory migration would be the norm. With longer-term settlement, probably less likely, since borders would be easy and open. I'll give you a quick example. You see, for those who grew up under French influence, from those countries which were colonized by France. I mean, my own country was not really colonized by France, it was colonized by Germany. And then Germany lost the war, and the other powers decided that Germany was not capable of civilizing anybody. Because colonialism was akin to civilization. You colonize, you civilize. And I'm not inventing this. I mean, when you read those documents of the time, one of the reasons why Germany was deprived of its colonies was the decision that, no, because of what you have done, you are not apt to civilize anybody, so we take away the colonies. But that's an aside. So, in those countries in the 70s and 80s, you could go to Paris with your identity card. There was no problem of migrants because people knew that they could come and go. The moment you say you can't come, that's when you have a problem. You create a problem, and problems were created which we inherited, which have led right now in this continent of Europe to the existence, according to the latest counts, of at least 450 migrant camps in this continent. And at least 35,000 people detained in a whole variety of confinement institutions specialized for foreigners, which raises all kinds of questions, some of our biggest writers, Aimé Césaire and the others, raised long ago in his discourse on colonialism. Is it true that the destiny of Europe ends with camps? Is it true that at some point the camp form, as Agamben puts it, might be delinked from the history of Europe? I think we have to go back to some of those foundational questions. These are the questions one would want to raise when we bandy the concept of a borderless world. So I could go on and on this, but I think you get a little bit where I'm coming from and where I would like to go. And now, second set of remarks, I would like to make some remarks about the difficulty in the liberal tradition to indeed imagine the possibility of a borderless world. What is it that philosophically exists in that liberal tradition that makes it, if not impossible, at least extremely difficult to imagine a concept of a borderless world? I think that, and here I'm relying a lot on work done recently by an Israeli scholar called Hagar Kotef in a book which is called Movement and the Ordering of Freedom. It was published last year by Duke University Press. It's really a must in terms of reading. I rely a lot on her here, and I will, quote-unquote, supplement her after exposing to you what is her principal thesis. What is her principal thesis? Kotef tells us, I think quite convincingly, that liberal political thought has always been saddled with a contradiction when it comes to imagining the possibility of a borderless world. And this contradiction stems from its conception of movement. She shows that, in fact, two dominant configurations of movement constantly come into conflict with each other in the liberal tradition. On the one hand, movement is seen as a manifestation of freedom. And at the same time, and on the other hand, it is seen as an interruption of order. And this being the case, one of the functions of the state is therefore to craft a concept of order, stability, that is reconcilable with its concept of freedom, that is movement, as well as a concept of freedom that is reconcilable with its concept of order. It opposes these two things. I think I mentioned that it was 2 days ago, when I gave you the example of how African cities operate in a compositional manner and so forth and so on. But here, Kotef draws on a whole set of, a battery of sources and shows convincingly that this opposition has been absolutely central to liberal thought, and we see it including today. So it has led to a situation where, in fact, the state is, let's just put it like that, the enemy of people who restlessly move around. The state doesn't like people who are, you don't know where they are. In the morning they're here, midday they are somewhere else, in the evening they're restless, and they are usually configured as an inassimilable alterity. When you move too much, from the point of view of the liberal state, you cannot be assimilated, or you make it too difficult for whoever community, polity to assimilate you. This is because freedom, in this sense, in this context, is seen as being about moderation, as implying self-restraint, self-regulation, is not about excess, and on the contrary, excessive movement immediately conjures problems of security. Unbound movement is seen as a threat. And the belief is that freedom is only politically valuable if it relies on some mechanisms that regulate the movement that manifests it. And I think that this is true, that it is historically proven, both in the history of the West and in the history of colonial expansion overseas. The biggest, I mean, once I was a historian, if you want, so I worked in the archives. I used to spend time in the archives, writing about whatever. And when you read the colonial archives, from the beginning to the end, one of the biggest problems for the colonial state has to do with how to domesticate the natives. Why? Because the natives are constantly on the move. And you can't build a state If you don't control borders, you don't control the population, you can't tax them, you can't exercise a monopoly over violence, the usual classical Weberian definition of sovereignty. And you find yourself in this kind of rhizomatic social configuration where everything seems to be on top of everything else, underneath everything else. There's no transparency, there's no stability. So the big issue was, what do we do in order to stabilize these people? So movement then had to be restrained via an array of disciplinary mechanisms for it to be reconciled with freedom. I could go on and on this, but you get the core, let's say, issue. So how is it that you make sure that people don't move restlessly? Liberal thought assumes that those who have an estate, a home, a nation state, or those who have the material conditions allowing them to stay where they are, can better enjoy the right to move freely. Which means that not everybody should be moving freely. In Western liberal political tradition, it's not accepted that everybody should be moving freely. It is admitted that those who should enjoy the right to move freely should be, first of all, those people who own something. And the belief is that that something they own tethers them to a place, a location, to which they come back. Because the idea of moving and everywhere or not coming back is not at all taken into consideration here. You are allowed to move and never come back only as if you belong to the category of surplus people. And you have a lot of historical studies which show, for instance, how in England, the poor, how do you get rid of your poor? You get rid of your poor by sending them to Australia, sending them to South Africa, sending them to Canada, and making sure that they don't come back. Through colonialism, then, colonial expansion is, in that sense, part of this process I was calling early on, redistribution of life over the body of the earth, in this case by ridding the nation from those people who cannot stay in one place and who are vagabonds, the concept of the vagrant in the colonial lexicon. And that is what Kotef argues. We have to add to that, and I think you understand this, another configuration which has to do not only with the poor, but with the racialized body. Because in this liberal political configuration, the racialized body is not simply the body of the poor. It's a different kind of body that has been dishonored. This question of dishonoring and stigmatizing is absolutely central to the constitution of liberalism and of capitalism. And as I try to explain in Critique of Black Reason, this is how historically it has proceeded. So the racial body has to be sequestered. And the sequester, I don't know what's the term in German, but it has quite a powerful resonance in English. So we have a different genealogy of order stability if we put into consideration not only gender, class dimensions, but also racial dimensions, the racial body. And as I was arguing 2 days ago, you have a long genealogy for anyone who is interested in dealing with questions of mass incarceration, which are a key feature of the US society today. And mass incarceration, confinement, and all that, there's nothing more opposite to the idea of a borderless world than that. So, even more so in settler, slave-owning and settler colonial societies, settler liberty, settler freedom of movement requires the criminalization of countless others, and such instances of criminalization and stigmatization were historically indispensable features of liberal government everywhere. So, I think I have been clear enough on this for you to understand where I'm coming from. Now let me try to move faster and complicate matters even further. I'll make two additional sets of remarks and I'll stop. I will make a set of remarks on another dialectics that is part of our contemporary life at a planetary level, is the dialectics of circulation, speed, and containment. And here, I haven't spoken a lot about speed. Let me say a few words about it now. We have spoken about movement, borders, not enough about speed, although I have been intimating that you can't talk about movement without motion without speed. And here, I will rely especially on a French thinker called Paul Virilio. Paul Virilio, in a piece he wrote long ago, well before some of the developments we see happening now, the piece was called Speed and Information. He was arguing that the twin phenomena of immediacy and instantaneity is presently, this was in the early 80s, one of the most pressing problems confronting us. I'm quoting him. Or, still quoting him, in any case, one of the most determining factors ushering a new techno-political epoch. So from then on, he was very aware of this clash. So we can use Virilio's considerations on speed and information to argue that in considering what borders have become and the kind of work they accomplish, or for that matter, what a borderless world might look like, it might be useful to take seriously the possibility that real time now prevails above both real space and the geosphere in general. So the primacy of real time, of immediacy over and above space and surface might not yet be irreversible, but it is in the process of becoming a fait accompli. And in fact, of the three main physical barriers, those of sound, in quantum physics, there are three key barriers. The barrier of sound, the barrier of heat, and the barrier of light. There might be some others, but these are the three key structuring barriers. And of the three main physical barriers, the first two have already fallen. The barrier of sound and the barrier of heat. So, if you want, we are now struggling against the barrier of light. The sound barrier, Virilio argues, has been cut across by the super or hypersonic aircraft. The heat barrier is penetrated by the rocket taking human beings outside the Earth's orbit in order to land them on other planets. But the third barrier that of light, in fact, might not be something one can cross. You crash into it, and it is precisely this barrier of time which confronts history in the present day. So, building from these remarks, we can argue that the moment humanity will reach the light barrier, that is, the speed of light, a historical event of unprecedented importance will happen. We will have entered a borderless world. We'll enter a borderless world when we triumph over the barrier of light and the speed that is embedded in the projection of light, precisely because we'll have finally domesticated absolute speed. To some extent, what I'm arguing is that this is a true utopia. The idea of a borderless world is a true utopia, because the moment I don't believe that this will happen, and yet we will keep trying to domesticate absolute speed, and if we ever manage to do so, I think the Earth will enter a new period of its history, one in which real time will be totally superseded, will have totally superseded real space. So we are not yet there. So meanwhile, since we are not yet there, architecture of containment is dominating the ways in which our planet is being reorganized. The planet is being reorganized around an architecture of containment and a division of the populations of the Earth in at least two categories. To put it quickly, on the one hand, the category of those lives which are insured, questions of insurance, meaning those lives which, the death of which has to be motivated, that you cannot kill, nobody should die without reason. And those insured lives are produced through a whole set of mechanisms the welfare state in the West embodies, where an order, a political order, in which the main function of the state is to protect life and to enhance it, and to ensure those lives. So those populations on the one hand, and the mass of the uninsured, whose life can be taken, exposed, or abandoned without any justification being given for it. So it seems to me that when we raise questions of borders, we are speaking to these reallocation, these reapportionment, this repartition of the Earth between different sorts of species life, if you want. Species life that are insured and species life that have to fend for themselves. And the border today, as well as we move on inside the century, will precisely act as a barrier to the conjoining of these two. And racism plays a very important part in keeping these two life species separate. And here I don't need to rely on Foucault and his Society Must Defend It. You remember the last chapters, the last lessons, where he deals with questions of racism. Unfortunately, here again, Foucault, although, when Foucault is writing, apartheid is at its apogee. It's the highlight of apartheid. But Foucault was not interested in colonialism and those worlds beyond Europe. So here again we have to keep supplementing, I'm sorry to keep going back to this figure of speech, this tradition, But if we want to produce a kind of thought that attends to the planetary, which is the moment we are in, then that act of supplementation is absolutely necessary. And it's very different from what my friend Dipesh Chakrabarty argues for. He argues for the provincializing of Europe. I don't believe that Europe should be provincialized. I think all corners of the world should be deprovincialized. And it is only at this condition that we will be able to produce a kind of critical thought that is at the measure of the challenges we are facing, whether here in Germany, in France, or in South Africa for that matter. Thank you very much.